Hi guys, and welcome back to the Bird Photography Show with Glenn Bartley
Hello, everybody.
and me, Jan Wegener. First of all, we want to announce the winner from last week's Hummingbird book giveaway, Glenn's new book that's coming out July 19th. And the first winner is Werner B. I think you know how to contact me, so just shoot me an email and we will hook you up with your book. We will also be giving away another book in this episode, so make sure to watch till the end to find out how you can win.
So, Jan, in our last episode, you had just received your R7 and you've had some time to be out in the field with the camera, play around with some different birds. So, why don't you just tell us kind of like your first impressions and what you're sort of thinking about the camera?
At the beginning, I used the camera mainly in low light, and that's where I found that it was struggling at times with the autofocus, with the image stabilization, also with the shutter shock that I was getting from the mechanical shutter. But then when I actually started to use the camera outside of the rainforest, I was getting some very nice shots and also some more consistent results in terms of the autofocus. All in all, I must say that especially with the image quality and the ISO performance, I'm very happy. That's definitely better than I expected it to be. I actually thought the image quality would be the biggest issue, but that's actually no concern for me at all. Is that the same for you?
Yeah, I think my feelings kind of echo yours on that. The main thing is that you've got a crop body with 30 megapixels, because if you're shooting with an R6, for example, and you put it into crop mode, it's like really not a lot of megapixels getting on your subject. The R5 is pretty good. You're getting 17 or so megapixels, but with this, you're almost getting twice as much megapixels on the subject. And for obviously small birds, when you're doing sort of field photography, that's really exciting. Also, like I know, for example, Jan, you use the 100 to 500. How's it been with that on this camera?
I think the 100 to 500 is actually one of the lenses why I really like the R7, because now I have effective 800 millimeters of focal length when I'm shooting with this tiny combo, and I can easily handhold it. And there were situations, for instance, at a flowering bush where I was photographing honey eaters, and with the R5 100 to 500, I was kind of constrained to the lower branches because at the top of the bush they were just too far away because it was on a hill. So to get the birds on top of the bush with not a sky background, I had to walk back probably 10-15 meters to stand on top of the hill. But then with the R5 it was getting quite small in the frame, and then I put on the R7, I'm like, woo, I can now stand on top of the hill and I'm basically shooting these birds at eye level.
Yeah.
So in these situations, having the 1.6 crop factor was definitely really good.
And this is something that I've always, really felt is, why I stuck with the 7D2 instead of going to like a 5D Mark IV for so long is that, 60% more reach when you're using like a 600 millimeter lens or in this case a 100 to 500. It's a massive difference in the size, in the number of pixels you're getting on the bird. So it's a really huge deal. So that is really awesome about this camera.
I actually never thought I was missing out on shooting full frame until we were standing, I think it was somewhere in WA, and we were shooting some, I think it was New Holland honeyeaters, the subspecies there. And I had a 5D Mark IV and Glenn had a 7D Mark II on the 600 with the 1.4 extender. And we're looking at the pictures on the back of the camera and I'm like, it's like you had the bird like this big in the frame, and on my camera it was like this tiny. And
Yeah.
that was the one time where I really felt inadequate with the full frame camera. And having a 1.6 crop camera now, you can definitely appreciate the extra effective focal length you're getting.
Now, one of the other really cool kind of features, which actually I think in previous episodes before the R7 was even announced, we were kind of asking for, we were sort of saying, oh, Olympus has this cool pro capture thing that can start recording before you take the pictures. And we were kind of asking Canon to give us some of that as well. And they sure have in this camera, which is really cool, but it's very limited application given the buffer constraints on this camera. So really, when you think of this feature, I think personally, the only time I would actually use it is for like that kind of blast off action. So for example, there's a duck on the pond and you think he's going to take off. Well, you could enable that feature and be able to get a few frames back before you actually push the button. Or maybe there's a bird that's on a branch and you think he's going to take off. That would be a great time to use it as well. But in terms of like everyday shooting, it's not really something that I would see myself using. But another great feature, and for example, I would love to see them add it to the R5 as a firmware thing or something like that, because it really is another tool in our toolbox as bird photographers that could potentially help us capture that really dynamic action shot. And speaking of action shots, this little baby will shoot at 30 frames a second, so just as fast as the R3 in electronic shutter mode.
And there's actually another amazing feature that's basically unheard of in this sort of price range, and that's the eye tracking in photo and video mode that the R7 has, and that works very well in good light.
If you are coming from the DSLR world and you've never shot with a camera with eye tracking, it's really such a game-changing feature that you kind of ultimately need to get into that world. This camera brings it in at a very reasonable price point. You know, the R5 is a pretty expensive camera, and obviously some of the more expensive ones. So that's great. That's really great.
And also having it in video mode. For instance, a Sony A1 doesn't even have eye tracking in video mode. So now you're getting something in a $1,500 camera that you normally don't even get in like a $6,000 camera.
There was a lot of kind of hype when this camera first came out, and I was hearing like, oh, they're putting the exact same autofocus system as the R3 in this, $1,500 R7. Now, Jan, you have shot with both the R3 extensively and now this camera. Do you feel like the autofocus performs identically on these two cameras?
It doesn't perform the same in the field. It's definitely less sticky than like an R3 or even an R5. If you never used it before or used an R5 or an R6 or an R3 before, you probably won't notice that difference and it will feel really good. But if you're coming from an R3, for instance, or an R5, you'll notice that the autofocus is just less sticky and has some inconsistencies at times where it just seems to track the eye well and then jump off. Overall, the tracking is very well done, but it just doesn't have the same precision and stickiness of the R3. And where that especially shows is in low light. In good light, I'm getting probably 90% keeper rate with my shots, so very happy there. But in low light, this rate drops down dramatically.
On the R7, you notice that there's sort of this variability. Some are great, and then you'll have 2 or 3 that are a little soft, and then you'll have another one that's good. And so it's just not quite as consistent. But again, should it be for a camera that's significantly less than half the price of the R5 and probably, like a quarter of the price of an R3?
I think for the price point, the autofocus system almost overperforms. I think it was just the expectation that it would be like an R3, but that was probably unreasonable from the beginning, because why would a $1,500 camera track the same as a $6,000 camera? And I personally found to get around some of these issues, it's good to not focus for too long. Like on the R5, you can hold down the button and you can track it for like a minute and it will be fine. I noticed that on the R7, it will wander off after a certain period of time. So I actually get better results if I only kind of focus just before I want to take some images. So maybe keep it down to like not longer than maybe 5 seconds or something. And then it seems to track better.
In some ways, depends on how you set your camera up. So one of the things that both of us have done and is gone into that second autofocus menu, the one that has the cases, I want to edit one of the cases and move the little dial all the way to the left, or at least one notch to the left, to the negative side of things. And basically what we're doing then is allowing that once you've got the subject, that it's not going to try to look for something else, and it's going to stay stuck and stay tracking that subject. So I think if you get this camera, you're definitely going to want to go in and change that.
Totally. I actually have it at -1 and case 1 on both of my R5 cameras. But on the R7, I actually put it to -2 on both of the settings and case 1, because I feel like it just, whatever can slow it down and make it more sticky will be good. And this is what I've done, and it's working quite well. And if you guys want to know how Glenn and I have set up our whole R7 and how we're getting the best results, we're also releasing a setup guide that you can get down there in the description, where we share all our settings and explain to you exactly what you need to know about all the settings.
Absolutely. In our setup guide, we're going to show you exactly how we have our cameras set up, using dual button, back button focus, how exactly we do that, and all the other little tweaks we've made. So definitely check that out down in the description.
The image stabilization and the IBIS of the R7, for instance, is just not as stable as on an R5 and the 100 to 500 millimeter lens. I'm sure this has to do with more effective focal length, because now I'm not stabilizing 500 millimeter, I'm stabilizing 800 millimeters, which is a lot of a difference. And if I put the 1.4 extender on the 100 to 500, the image stabilization also gets a lot worse. So I think it has to do with stabilizing a long focal length, but it's just noticeably more shaky. So in low light conditions, having a little bit more shaky image stabilization certainly contributes to some more kind of blurry images. And the other issue I noticed that with the mechanical and the first curtain electronic shutter, you have very dramatic shutter shock inside the camera. I mean, you can hear it with that loud sound already, but I noticed if I'm shooting at like a 200th of a second handheld, I'm basically not able to get a single sharp photo. I get maybe one critically sharp photo out of a burst of 20, 30, 40 images. And you can see vibrations in the images. Like it's almost sharp, but then you can kind of just see it moving like a little bit. And I expect that is the shutter shock inside the camera. So the only good shutter mode I've found in low light conditions is the electronic shutter mode, where the hit rate goes up dramatically. But then you have these severe wobbles that you're getting with the electronic shutter and R7 on a lot of lenses.
Just like in the DSLR days, would you have expected a 90D or a 7D2 to perform as well as a 5D4 or 1DX in low light? No, you wouldn't. You wouldn't expect that, would you? So it's the same story here. You have to know the strengths and weaknesses of your camera, and unless you're buying the very top of the line equipment, there are going to be some shortcomings. That's just the reality.
Totally, and I think I was just forced to use that camera in these conditions because that's where I was staying. But I probably had unreasonable expectations from using an R5 and an R3 in these conditions, where I basically always get a lot of keepers, and that rate was a lot lower under R7, but I was still able to get images in most cases, but only if I was using the electronic shutter.
So in those conditions there that you just described, Jan, I guess you must have been using pretty high ISO speeds.
Yeah, the first few weeks of using the camera, I probably did not go below ISO 1600 on it or something. And I was shooting a lot at like 6400, even 12,800. And personally, I think the image quality was more than acceptable.
This sort of modern bird photography, you have to have a modern post-processing workflow. And right now, DxO Pure RAW still doesn't support this camera. So the real test is going to be once DxO supports the R7 to go out and shoot at ISO 6400, ISO 12800, run it through that, and then see what those files look like.
Like this olive-backed sunbird that I found on top of a flower in the botanical gardens. I was actually using the R7 100 to 500 1.4 extender to capture it. And the lighting conditions were pretty difficult. I didn't use flash, so it was a little bit dark in the face, but I used our Pro sets to give me great colors and a great starting point, and they worked very well on the R7. And then I used my editing workflow that I teach in my masterclass to get to the final result. And I know Glenn also has some fantastic editing resources, and we linked all of these, our Pro sets, our classes, and our ebooks down there in the description for you.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, we're trying to get the best final result. And if you're going to get the best final result, you have to not only have a good tool to take the picture, but you then have to invest in getting the best results in the digital darkroom. As we said, using DxO Pure RAW, using our Pro sets, and then following the instructions that we teach you either in my ebooks or Jan's masterclass to get those absolutely amazing final results. We want to give you the real information for bird photographers. So another thing that we're going to offer to hopefully help some of you out is some sample files that we've taken over the last few weeks of actual birds. You can download them for free, check them out, see if you process them how you like, and make the decision whether this camera is for you. So we'll leave a link for those sample bird files shot with the R7 down in the description.
Where I am, there's mainly rainforest, so I was scrambling around looking for some places to photograph some birds in flight, and I actually found this lake with probably like 1,000 plumed whistling ducks on it, and they were just flying from the left to the right, and they were a little bit far away, but with the effective 800mm focal length of the 100 to 500 on the R7, I was actually able to get them reasonably large in the frame. And I must say, I didn't expect too much in terms of good results, but I was getting some really nice series of sharp flight shots at relatively high ISO in still morning light, but kind of overcast, sort of shaded morning light. And overall the performance was pretty good, and I definitely got some keepers out of that session that I was very happy with. So in terms of the tracking, once we changed the settings to how we describe it in our guide, I got some really good results. I was pretty happy with the performance.
How did the buffer perform when you were doing all that action photography?
Well, you guys know I'm a big advocate of shooting as fast as you can. If the camera gives me 30 frames per second, I want to use 30 frames per second, which did become a bit of an issue, like we can see in this example here. Watch the red arrow. Woof! Already gone, my buffer. So you have to be conscious of that if you're shooting with the electronic shutter into 30 frames per second, because if you shoot too early, you will be buffered out before the bird even comes close to you. But there's a few ways to circumvent that issue, isn't there?
You can put it down into the slightly lower speed drive mode, which would put you down to 15 frames a second, which is still quite fast. And I think for this camera, I mean, on my R5, I shoot in C-RAW anyways, but I think in this camera, you definitely want to shoot in C-RAW, because again, those are smaller files that are going to write quicker to these SD cards, which are not as fast. Definitely shoot C-RAW. And if you're really getting annoyed and hitting that buffer over and over and over again, drop it down into 15 frames a second, and at least you'll have a little bit longer of a burst. This camera has some actually pretty cool video features. So how do you feel? Because obviously Yan is definitely more into the world of video than I am, but you know, what do you think this camera does right when it comes to video?
I think it's super capable. It doesn't have a lot of option. You can basically shoot 4K 30p and 4K 60p. That's it. So you don't need to have a lot of elaborate functions or a lot of elaborate programming like an R5 that has so many different video modes. There's basically more or less just 2 modes for you, but it actually works pretty well. It's oversampled 4K video, so it's nice and sharp, good image quality. It doesn't have the all eye compression that the R5 file has. It just has the IPB compression like the R6, which is a little bit lower quality, but also the files are smaller, but they still look really good. So there's no issue there for me. And it has the amazing animal eye tracking in video mode as well, and it seems to work pretty good. So, and this is something that almost no other camera has. So at this price point, having eye tracking in video mode is truly remarkable. And I think it's a nifty little video camera. The only issue I kind of run in is that the image stabilization is worse. So with the R5 or R3 100 to 500, it's quite easy to do handheld video with the 100 to 500. It's very stable. With the R7, this is actually a challenge because it kind of moves and shakes. So you might have to use a tripod more there, but it's pretty good overall.
I think if you're somebody who's enjoyed shooting little clips of the birds, one of the huge problems with the DSLRs was, of course, you could take great videos, but really only of like a stationary subject. As soon as the thing starts moving around in the frame, you're going to lose focus. Whereas now with this, with the eye tracking, you can definitely follow a moving bird or a moving subject. So if you're really into video, this could be a really nice little camera for you.
So Glenn, who do you think is this camera for? Who will be very happy with an R7?
Really, anybody who hasn't made the jump into the R series lineup in Canon, or if you don't even have a camera and you're first getting into bird photography. I mean, think back to the first DSLR camera you ever had as a bird photographer, and then imagine someone gave you this instead. Like, this is unbelievably capable compared to the tools that both of us started with, 15 whatever years ago. So if you're just getting started out in the world of bird photography, this is going to be an amazing camera. And if you're still shooting with a 90D or a 7D too, I think this is also quite a nice upgrade, mainly just for that eye tracking feature.
Totally, I agree. I would basically pick this over any DSLR camera because the eye tracking is just so game changing. It allows you to focus on taking the images without having to worry too much about keeping the autofocus point on the bird, and that has allowed me to take so many images I could have never taken before. So having this feature alone is probably worth it.
It's funny you mentioned DSLRs because, when I was out doing my ISO performance test, I had, the 90D, the 7D2, the R5, and the R7. And when I had to go back from the mirrorless cameras to the DSLR, it was really dark. I mean, I could barely see. It was like when you walk into a bright room or a dark room or whatever, and your eyes haven't adjusted. And like, I'm looking through the viewfinder and I could barely even see the target. So that's like, it's a crazy thing to have these EVFs And when you have to go back to shooting with a DSLR, it's just like, no, no, thank you.
This is actually a great point because so many people are concerned about losing the optical viewfinder, but I would never want to go back now. I have a histogram in the viewfinder. I can see my exposure in the viewfinder. It's just amazing. Even the relatively low resolution viewfinder of the R7, in my opinion, trumps any optical viewfinder because the advantages are just so great, especially in low light.
This camera is a very good value at its price point, and it brings a lot to the table for a certain set of bird photographers out there.
And actually, if you don't have an R5, R6, or R3, you won't even notice any of the issues that we've talked about today, basically, and the camera will just feel amazing. I think where some of the things that people talk about come from is that people thought they could have an R7 as a second body to an R5 or an R6. And I think it's a little bit more tricky there because the ergonomics are quite different. You're missing the third button to change your ISO. So there's definitely some learning curves there. And when I was using it side by side with an R5, my fingers kind of went all over the back, always trying to find the right button. So there's a bit of a learning curve there. I got there in the end, but having more similar ergonomics, if you want it as a second body, would have been good.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be totally honest with everybody watching the show, this is exactly the conundrum that I'm facing right now. I have my R5. I love it. Camera Canada was nice enough to send me this one to try out, and I don't know if I'm going to keep it yet. I'm not sure if I would rather save up a bit more money and buy a second R5 or wait for what might come next, or just enjoy this camera for what it is as a backup body for me, and in certain situations I might use it. I don't know what I'm going to do. Let me know down in the comments. What should I do, people?
Well, I can say for myself, I'll probably keep it around because I quite enjoyed on that 100 to 500 millimeter lens as a walk around lens if there's birds that are a little bit further away. Having this small package that gets me to 800 millimeters is actually quite amazing and something, at least in good light, that I probably don't want to miss anymore. So Glenn, now we all want to know, how can we get another copy of that book?
All right, guys, if you want to win this copy of the Hummingbirds book, since this episode was all about equipment, what we're going to get you to do is down in the comments, tell us the first camera you ever used to photograph birds and also the camera you're currently using to photograph birds. Let us know down in the comments. Be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel.
And we will pick a winner in our next episode.
So Jan, what would be your kind of closing statements here?
I personally had a lot of fun with it in the field. Some frustrating moments in low light, but overall I was quite happy with it and I really enjoyed that extra reach, especially on that 100 to 500 millimeter lens. What about you?
Well, I think I can sum up my thoughts in simply saying that I wish when I was starting in bird photography that this camera was available, because honestly, for the price point and what this camera packs into it, it's not perfect. It's not a top of the line bird photography camera, but given the price point, it's pretty darn nice.
And on that note, let's wrap up this bird photography show for this week. We hope you guys enjoyed it. We want to hear all your thoughts down there in the comments. We appreciate a thumbs up and a subscription to the channel, and we will see you very soon in our next video. Bye guys.
Comment down below if you want to win this book. Thanks for watching, guys. We'll see you next time.